I acknowledge the presence of the principals of both colleges, Dr. Milind Barahate of CPN Berar College and Dr. Nandagauri of Dr. LD Balkhande College, and appreciate their efforts in making this webinar happen. Having taught English as a second language for a number of years, we have always felt that while teaching any new language is a difficult task, teaching English has its own unique set of problems. Anxiety brought on by the fear of ridicule and anxiety brought on by the fear of failure in English, leading to fewer life opportunities, are the twin barriers to effective language acquisition. Is it the same the world around? Does the prevailing cultural atmosphere of any region or country make a difference to the way students learn? Are there any specific tools or techniques that can be used to help students learn faster, better, and with less anxiety? What can we as teachers do to motivate them? Today's webinar seeks to answer some of these questions. All three of our speakers are native speakers of English and have taught extensively in countries where English is not the first language. Dr. Maggie and John Lieb spent many years teaching in Japan, while Dr. Mick King has taught in the Emirates and is now based in Qatar. They have all taught English to students whose first language was not English. Today, they share with us their experiences, and I'm certain they will be very enriching. May I add that all three of them have been very good friends to me over the years. They have personally visited CPN Berar College when they were in Nagpur 8 years ago, and we are extremely happy to have them back here, although it is a virtual platform this time. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Margaret M. Lieb, to the audience. She is originally from Ireland and has taught students of all ages in Ireland, the United States, and Japan for over 30 years. She has spent the past 17 years teaching sociolinguistics, intercultural communication, and English language courses to students at universities in Japan. Most recently, she has taught and conducted research as an associate professor at Mukogawa Women's University, Japan. Her research interests include cultural influences on language, communication, and behavior, particularly in the context of international higher education, as well as ethics in English language teaching. She has researched and published extensively in the field of ELT and has presented at conferences throughout Asia, including Confluence 4 in Nagpur, where she was the keynote speaker in 2013. I request Dr. Maggie Lieb to share her experiences with us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anjali, for inviting me to join this webinar. It's very kind of you to invite me to speak today, and it's an honor and a privilege to be here. So just a moment, and I have a screen that I would like to share with my slides. Okay, I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I would like to speak today about challenges of teaching English to non-English speaking students. And based on the fact that I've been speaking and working in Japan for 17 years, I would like to share some of my experiences teaching in Japan. And I hope that there are some ideas here that are also relevant to the teaching context in India. So what I would like to talk about today are 4 areas. First, I will give some context on English language education in Japan, and then I will talk about challenges of teaching English in Japan in 3 major categories: societal challenges, linguistic challenges, and cultural challenges. So as we all know, investment in English is growing as it is viewed as an essential driver of economic growth and international competitiveness. So, despite its meteoric rise as one of the world's largest economies in the aftermath of World War II, Japan is dealing with a number of societal challenges, And these include a declining population, a dropping birth rate, and an aging population and pension crisis. These are some of the reasons why there is increased awareness of the need to raise English language proficiency in Japan. So Japan's Ministry of Education has prioritized English language proficiency as it is seen as beneficial to expanding individual opportunities, employment and career advancement, and also increasing Japan's competitiveness in globalized world. So the Ministry of Education in Japan sees it as a priority to produce global human resources. So Japanese businesses are also increasingly demanding internationally minded employees to increase Japan's international competitiveness. For example, Honda has decided to make English its corporate lingua franca, its official language, as of 2020, as a large portion of its sales are in the United States. Similarly, other Japanese companies like Uniqlo, Rakuten, and Bridgestone have English-only policies. So, as a result, the ministry has taken several steps to improve English proficiency, including mandatory English language classes from 3rd and 5th grade in elementary schools. English language classes are a foreign language activity from 3rd grade, but an official school subject from 5th grade. They've also taken the measure to increase English classes in junior high school by 30%. They have also taken the measure or recommended that classes be conducted entirely in English in high schools. They are promoting participation in study abroad programs, and they are encouraging more efficient use of ALTs. So ALTs refers to assistant language teachers, which I will come back to later, but basically they are native English speakers recruited from inner circle countries to help with language teaching in Japan. Despite these efforts, however, it is estimated that among the general Japanese population, less than 10% have professional working proficiency in English. And that refers to all 4 skills: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. But when you look at speaking fluency, less than 5% are estimated to have business level conversation fluency. And that's, again, just looking at speaking ability. So there is concern in Japan about their international ranking when it comes to English proficiency. Both TOEIC and TOEFL scores are considered to be comparatively low compared to other Asian countries and other OECD countries. And the English First English Proficiency Index ranked Japan quite low and as having low proficiency out of 80 countries, although the caveat here is that these scores are from the English First Proficiency Index, in which the sampling method is self-selection. So these scores are not necessarily representative of these regions. However, they speak to an overall pattern of low English language proficiency in Japan compared to other Asian countries and compared to other industrialized countries. So it's no surprise, therefore, that this also affects students in Japan who, despite 6 years of mandatory English education, Japanese students achieve a mediocre level of English proficiency. And so when I say 6 years, I'm referring to 3 years in junior high school and 3 years in high school. Then the students enter university, and that is where I encounter them. And so upon entering university, this is where their lack of communicative ability becomes an issue. So back in 2016, there was a survey conducted by the Japanese Ministry of Education among 12,800 schools across Japan. And this survey found that about 1/3 of junior high and high school graduates met the English language proficiency benchmarks set by the Ministry of Education. Similarly, with about 1/3 of junior high school teachers and 2/3 of high school teachers, there was a similar disappointment that not the majority met English language proficiency benchmarks set by the ministry. And I should mention that this is inconsistent with Japan's overall educational achievement. 15-year-olds in Japan, for example, score higher in reading, mathematics, and science literacy on PISA assessments compared to other OECD countries. And on the IEA TIMSS, 4th and 8th grade students in East Asian countries, including Japan, consistently lead the world in mathematics and science. So there's rising concern about low levels of English proficiency in Japan, not only from the point of view of business, but also because of Japan's increasing diversity. So Japan is often perceived as a, quote, homogeneous country, homogeneous society, perhaps because its foreign-born population was less than 2%, and consists of people from China, Korea, the Philippines, and Brazil. However, that number is increasing annually. Also, Japanese people are being exposed to intercultural contact through ethnic groups currently living in Japan, such as immigrants from Latin America, South and Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, as well as intermarriages producing children who cross ethnic, national, and racial lines. So there is evidence of increasing diversity in Japan. So it's been put like this: sojourners, immigrants, and long-term residents alike, some, quote, lucking Japanese, some not, are now part of the fabric and life of Japanese society, representing about the same level of diversity as the United Kingdom in 1990. So language classrooms, of course, are no exception. So the Ministry of Education, as I mentioned already, has vowed to enhance students' English proficiency by promoting the continued recruitment of ALTs, assistant language teachers, who are generally native English speakers from inner circle countries. Also, many Japanese students take classes taught by international teachers, including native and non-native English-speaking teachers. And native English-speaking teachers in particular differ considerably from students in their cultural dimensions and value orientations. So I will come back to this point later. So based on this context, I would like to focus on challenges in teaching English in 3 areas in Japan: societal challenges, linguistic challenges, and cultural challenges. So let's start with societal challenges. So, as I mentioned already, Japan's meteoric rise after World War II to become one of the world's largest economies has led many to believe that English is not necessary. In some ways, Japan is blinded by the light of its past successes. So Japan still has one of the lowest dependencies on foreign trade in the world, and it's light years away from requiring nationwide English fluency to keep the economy going. So this is a disincentive. But in order to sustain this economic growth, English is necessary. And according to a professor of language and culture at Nagoya University, big businesses have found that the Japanese market alone is not able to sustain the growth in profits they desire. So it follows that Japan needs English to do business with the rest of the world. So this mindset, of course, influences the approaches of policymakers and stakeholders in their attitudes to English language education. Another challenge in teaching English to Japanese students is that it is considered not necessary in daily life. English is not an official language in Japan, and there are low numbers of English speakers in Japan. But this is gradually changing as Japan becomes more diverse, as I've already mentioned. National identity issues also pose a challenge to teaching English in Japan. There is a certain amount of resistance to English language education among the Japanese public. There is also opposition among some to teaching English in elementary schools. In some sectors, English is perceived as a threat to Japanese language and culture. And there's also a strong desire to maintain Japanese national identity. So some research indicates that certain discourses in Japanese society pose obstacles to Japan's entry into the global community of English users. These are two of those discourses, Nihonjinron and Kokusai discourses. Now, these are Japanese words, and I'll just briefly explain them. So, Nihonjinron refers to a widespread belief in Japanese uniqueness and separateness from the rest of the world. The Kokusai discourse refers to a Japanese version of internationalization that is characterized more by nationalism than internationalization. So you can imagine that these discourses would have a negative impact on motivation to study English, and also on concepts like willingness to communicate and also international posture. So many of these societal attitudes manifest themselves in approaches to teaching English in Japan. Japan, as some people may be already aware, is characterized by grammar translation approaches to teaching English. In many cases, English is not really regarded as a living language. And English classes are often just a strict correspondence to university entrance examinations. And there tends to be an overemphasis on grammar translation and memorization. So a lot of the research indicates that grammar translation approaches are not conducive to helping students achieve communicative fluency in English. So Krashen, of course, has said victims of grammar-only type of instruction over-rely on conscious learning and are less likely to achieve fluency. Brown has said that grammar translation over-relies on deductive reasoning and does virtually nothing to enhance a student's communicative competence. And also, many Japanese junior high and high school students are accustomed to teacher-centered lecture-style English classes with extensive drilling and memorizing. So when these students enter university and they take student-centered communicative English classes from international teachers, they are often perceived as shy and reticent. So moving on to linguistic challenges. So I think it's fair to say that in any situation where teachers and students have different L1s, the issue of linguistic distance is always a challenge. The linguistic distance between English and Japanese is very large. If you look at all these areas, for example, vocabulary, there are no cognates between English and Japanese. Unlike English and other European languages, like German, where English is largely Germanic-based with a massive French influence and has large numbers of loan words from Latin and Greek, English does not share those cognates with Japanese. There are also completely different writing systems. Japanese has 3 alphabets, and the basic phonemes often differ from English, and this affects pronunciation and comprehensibility. There are different grammar systems. For example, Japanese doesn't have articles. Japanese makes limited use of singular and plural. They have markers called particles that they use to modify subjects and objects. Japanese make very limited use of pronouns, etc. There are also very different pragmatic systems. Pragmatics refers to social language use. So social language use differs greatly between English and Japanese. Japanese tends to have a lot more formulaic, ritualistic language than English. There are different languages, different forms of language and address for in-groups and out-groups in Japanese. And also, there are different sentence structures. So English follows the basic sentence structure, subject, verb, object, whereas in Japanese, the basic sentence structure is subject, object, verb, with the verb at the end of the sentence. So I came across this recently that illustrates the different sentence structures very well. And this gives you an idea of how challenging it would be for students learning, Japanese students learning English, and for me as a native English speaker studying Japanese. So here we have a sentence. The English sentence is, I want to try on a suit that I saw in a shop that's across the street from the hotel. So if you look at the French translation, je veux essayer un costume que j'ai vu dans une boutique en face de l'hôtel. So you can see that the subject and the verb and the object are basically in the same position in the sentence in English and in French by the sentence diagramming that is here. However, if you look at the Japanese translation of the same sentence, you can see that the words are completely rearranged. The only word that is in the same position in the English and Japanese sentence is the subject. In English, I, in Japanese, watashi wa. So you can also see that the second word in this sentence is hotel. This is a loan word in Japanese, hotel, the hotel. And want to is over here at the end of the sentence, mitai desu, which is to want to do something in Japanese. So as I said, the verb comes at the end of the sentence in Japanese. So in my years teaching in Japan, I have discovered that the differences in sentence structure pose significant obstacles to Japanese students in achieving English proficiency, not only oral proficiency, but also in writing. So moving on to cultural challenges. So I would like to focus on culture distance. The concept of culture distance represents, I think, a significant challenge in teaching English to non-English speaking students. It's a complex concept, but it basically affects two areas: culture distance between English and Japanese languages, and culture distance between teachers and students. So many of you are probably familiar with Hofstede's cultural dimensions theory, which was developed in the 1970s, which identified first 4 and then 5 and then 6 cultural dimensions that could explain differences in work-related values, behaviors, and beliefs. So the 6 dimensions that are most commonly used are power distance, individualism, collectivism, masculinity, femininity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence restraint. And so Hofstede has recommended this theoretical framework for the study of cross-cultural learning situations, and has suggested that each of these dimensions affect the way students approach learning and the way teachers approach teaching. So if we look at cultural distance between English and Japanese languages, so the English language tends to be rooted in individualist societies where the individual is valued over the group, where people have an I identity, and where self-reliance and independence are valued. However, Japanese is rooted in Japan, which is collectivist, in which the group is valued over the individual, where people have a we identity, and where loyalty and reliance on groups are valued. So individualism and collectivism also impacts how communication is conducted in English and Japanese in many ways. So for example, when introducing yourself in English, you would commonly give your first name, followed by your family name, followed by your wider group, your company, your school, your affiliation. Whereas in Japanese, when introducing yourself, you start with the wider group, the affiliation, the company, the school. You narrow it down to the family group and give your family name, and then you give your first name. So you can see how this would be an obstacle in helping students communicate in a different manner than they're culturally accustomed to. Another example of culture distance between English and Japanese languages relates to power distance. And power distance refers to the extent to which less powerful members of institutions and organizations accept that power is distributed unequally. So in societies that have high power distance, everyone has a defined place and role. They're more hierarchical, and polite language is commonly used. In low power distance societies, there is much more strong expectation of equality and egalitarianism. So Japanese is rooted in a high power distant, hierarchical, stratified culture. And so this is manifested in the use of keigo, polite language, honorifics, and humble language. Things like making strong distinctions in the languages that are used based on age, the use of humble language for self and when communicating with others. Whereas the English language tends to be rooted in cultures that tend to be more egalitarian and lower power distance. So there tends to be more use of casual language. There tends to be similar language used for older and younger people, and the use of first names is common. So moving on to culture distance between teachers and students. So we talked about the culture distance between English and Japanese languages, but as far as culture distance between students and teachers, this is an important question because culture affects how we perceive and organize and process knowledge. It affects our communication style. It affects how we solve problems. It also affects how we create mental categories and connect old learning to new learning. In effect, culture affects the preferences students have for thinking, relating to others, and particular types of classroom environments and experiences. So there is a lot of research on cross-cultural learning environments. For example, this study found that when instructors and students came from different cultural environments, that this can be disempowering to students. It also found that individualist, ambiguity-tolerant students had more positive experiences than collectivist, ambiguity-intolerant students. But I should mention that this was in an online environment where the teachers were also characterized as individualist and ambiguity tolerant. And that brings us back to Hofstede's cultural dimensions, which I mentioned earlier. So in order to investigate how culture impacts teaching and learning, the cultural dimensions of learning framework was developed. And the rationale for this framework was the increasing number of cross-cultural learning environments and the need to provide culturally sensitive and culturally adaptive instructional environments. And the theoretical underpinnings for this instrument came from social psychologists Hofstede, Richard Nisbet, and Robert Levine, also from cultural anthropologist Edward T. Hall, social theorist Richard D. Lewis, who is also a cross-cultural communications consultant. And so the cultural dimensions of learning framework measures 8 cultural learning preferences in 3 categories: social relationships, epistemological beliefs, and temporal perceptions. So a few years ago, I conducted an investigation that was a quantitative investigation comparing the cultural learning preferences of 119 Japanese students and 24 international teachers. And I found statistically significant differences in all categories, but practical significance was small. So I should mention that there were limitations in the study. There were limitations in the instrument. There were limitations as pertains to the use of self-reported data. And so the findings were inconclusive. However, the lack of conclusive findings reflects the inherent difficulty in conceptualizing and operationalizing culture distance and its impact on teaching English to non-English speaking students. The lack of conclusive findings should not be taken as evidence that culture is not a factor in L2 learning, because culture affects all behaviors, including learning. So I don't have very much time left, so I would just like to wrap up by summarizing what I touched on today. I tried to briefly touch upon some of the challenges in teaching English to non-English speaking students, including societal challenges such as Japan's past economic success, the fact that English is not necessary in daily life, and the issue of national identity, which is an issue all over the world. The second category I touched on was linguistic challenges and the linguistic distance between L1 and L2. And finally, I talked about cultural challenges, and I referred to this in terms of culture distance between L1 and L2, as well as culture distance between students and teachers. So a few years ago, when I was teaching in Tokyo, a colleague of mine said, I don't go to ELT conferences because there really isn't anything to say about English language teaching. So I hope that I have convinced you otherwise, and how complex and multifaceted English language teaching is in reality. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would like to share my references with you. Thank you very much.
Dr. Lee, it certainly was convincing that there really is a lot to be said where English language teaching is concerned. This was a very informative and gripping presentation. It was particularly interesting to hear about the discourses that hinder the learning of English. One of the aims of this webinar is to draw parallels between the circumstances surrounding ELTO all around the world. These discourses that you mentioned certainly mirror the ones in India that have become increasingly popular in recent years. And while they do instill a sense of pride in prioritizing the first language, it also closes professional doors. The choice is sometimes hard. So thank you for bringing that out very effectively.
Thank you very much, Patil.
Our second speaker today is John K. Lieb, MSc in TESOL, and is from the United States. He has more than 22 years of teaching experience. He taught high school English in USA, with experience dealing with high-risk youth. For the past 17 years, he has taught English at universities across Japan, including English for academic purposes, TOEFL, TOEIC, as well as business English. Most recently, he taught at Kobe University. His experience also includes designing and implementing courses for Japanese companies and teaching English to Japan's ground self-defense forces. He was awarded the Collins Prize for the Best Dissertation by Aston University while in the MSc in TESOL program. He is interested in the impact of culture on language acquisition. For personal reasons, he cannot join this Zoom session today, but he has very thoughtfully sent us a video of his presentation. I request Dr. Nishant Tipte to play the video. Before that, though, I would like to announce that anyone who has questions about any of the presentations may text them in the chat box. Dr. Tipte? Please give us a moment. We'll be right back. Can someone tell me if the video is audible?
I can't hear it, no.
Neither can I. Let me see what's going on. Zoom is a beautiful platform which can actually bring distant people together, but sometimes these are the perils. We have tested this video on at least 3 different laptops, and yet when it comes to playing it right now, we are unable to make it audible. But please give us a couple of minutes, and we are still trying. I'm sorry to interrupt again. Seems we are unable to get the audio going. Dr. McKing has very kindly offered that while we can get this sorted, he would be happy to go first. And Dr. King, I welcome you, but just allow me to properly introduce you first. We welcome the third speaker, now the second for today, Dr. McKing. He is an educator specializing in tertiary teaching in the broad discipline of teaching of English to speakers of other languages, which is TESOL. His career spans more than 30 years and has included teaching, lecturing, training, consultancy, and management. He is currently assistant professor in the Department of Languages and Literature at the Community College of Qatar. His research dissemination includes publication in books from recognized publishing houses and plenary speaker sessions. He has also taught at the Middlesex University, Dubai, and the Sharjah Higher Colleges of Technology. Dr. King has done his MSc in Educational Management in TESOL with distinction and has a doctorate of education in TESOL. He is a prolific writer as well as a very popular speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. King.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anjali, for your lovely presentation. It's very nice to see Maggie. We were together in Nagpur a few years ago and had a great time there at the conference. I'd like to thank both colleges involved in this seminar, and thank you very much for inviting me. I am currently on a staycation, so apologies that I'm in a t-shirt rather than a shirt. I forgot to pack one. So we are on the Eid break here in Qatar, and so I'm trying to get a little bit of R&R before we head back to work next week. Please forgive me, my voice is a bit croaky this morning. I'm not too sure why, but I do have a bottle of water with me to keep me lubricated. Yeah, so I am going to be talking today about motivation and student motivation to learn languages and how that clashes with teacher beliefs. And I think there's an issue here in that sometimes we want to practice our own beliefs in our teaching, but sometimes that leads to a clash with what students actually feel that they need. And I'm going to try to give you an overview of my career, really, to see how I've approached this over the years and how I believe I have become more understanding of students' needs and motivations as I've gone through my career. So I'm going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second so I can set it up. Okay,